The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Cyber Reason webinar Mac Attack, Why OS X Isn't as Secure as You Think. My name is Lital Ashadotan, and I will be your host today. I'm so glad to have with me our product manager, Nimrod Aldag. Nimrod, how are you doing?
I'm doing great, Lital. How are you?
Excellent, excellent. So thank you guys for joining us today. We're going to talk in details about specific attacks that are targeting Mac OS X and why this is something that security guys like you should care about. Today, our agenda is to talk about enterprise Mac users as a target. We'll have an overview of who is being targeted, how they're being targeted, how OS X is an attack surface in the eyes of attackers. And we'll talk about how you guys can mitigate OS X threats, obviously now that OS X is becoming so prevalent in organization, even if still Windows is the main OS in most enterprises. So without further ado, let's get into the trends that we're seeing. So when we look, Nimrod, about the global user trends in Mac, what are we seeing?
So I think that although Mac has a lot of popularity and obviously has a very distinct brand and reputation, recently over the last few years, we have seen some decrease in the use and procurement of Mac machines. And this is global. This means it addresses both private users as well as enterprises. But what is interesting to see is that, and we'll see it in the next slide, that enterprises are do tend to use Mac more and more. In the survey that was done, we do see that almost that over 90% of organizations of enterprises are using Mac to some extent. That does not mean that they're a complete Mac shop, but they are using Mac with some of their employees. We see that organizations, almost 50% of the organizations that were questions do offer a choice for employees whether to use a PC or a Mac. And as you can see, a survey done by IBM points that 73% of the employees want a Mac as their next machine. I think this goes back again to the branding and status of being a Mac user. And this is evident that a lot of organizations are putting more emphasis on making their employees feel more advanced or well-branded. And this is why we see maybe a slight increase in how organizations use this OS. However, and we'll continue forward, this really reflects on who is the users of macOS in the organization. So we tend to divide these users into three main categories. The first one is mainly product people, UI, UX people, who use Mac because it is usually the easiest platform for their operation. Even here in Cyber Reason, a lot of the product managers and UI, UX developers and designers use Mac because it is more a comfortable and easy to use environment for their day-to-day work. It is important to say maybe in the eye of an attacker, these sort of users are maybe not as interesting as other users that we're going to discuss in this webinar, because they're usually not exposed to as much information or sensitive information as other users. They are not developers, so they will not necessarily have access to code repositories. But there are definitely maybe the first pillar of users, of Mac users in an organization. The second one, as I just mentioned, is mainly developers and DevOps people. Again, because because Mac is based on Linux, it is very common for front-end and web developers to use Mac machines. And what's different about these users from maybe the product and UI UX guys is that they are using source code repositories on a daily basis. We've seen instances in before, not necessarily around Mac users, but general, that developers were targeted as a vector to get source code. This is something that is very common among Chinese attack groups. It is a known notion, a known way of Chinese organizations to create a very cheap, easy to use products that are basically based on stolen code. That is unfortunately something that is very common among several Chinese groups or vendors. And this is maybe the most prominent example of why targeting developers. So that's the second pillar, the second group of users in an organization. They're very interesting, but again, they are very focused on a specific game, which is source code. The last group, which is probably the most interesting one and most consistent one among enterprises, is C-level managers. We see it also in Cybereason and a lot of the organizations that we work with. A lot of managers prefer working with Mac, again, on the basis of the branding and the status that being a Mac user is. And even in organizations that are very strict on using PCs, usually C-level managers would get the exempt and would be able to use Mac even if it is not as easy to manage as other machines in the organization. Now, these users are extremely valuable for attackers because they have usually very high permissions. They are closest to future plans, to marketing presentations, to guns and plans for future business plans, etc. So if I, as an attacker, would be able to land on a machine of a C-level executive, I would probably have enough to start with. I can kind of pay the effort that I put into getting to that machine. And I think it's easy to say that this is, in many cases, the target of attackers that are targeting Mac.
And
okay, let's move forward.
Before we move on, I just wanted to mention that we will have a Q&A time at the end of the session. So if anyone has questions, please type your questions in the little box, chat box that you have in the bottom of the GoToWebinar platform, and we will be happy to address those as we go. Moving on. Yeah, so now we're going to talk about... Go ahead. Sorry, Nimrod.
So I want to discuss now how OS X is actually an attack surface, which means how this OS can actually be leveraged in order to perform attacks and gain value. So the first thing that I want to discuss is why basically Mac is a lucrative target. Why should I, as an attacker, choose to go after Mac machines in an organization and not just say, okay, there are more PCs out there, Windows is a much more broad operating system, why should I even go for Mac? So the main reasons that an attacker would probably tend to go to this OS, first of all, revolves around the perception. And I say this very cautiously, but a lot of people do consider Mac to be safe or safer than other operating system. We can have probably an infinite discussion around whether that's true or not, but it really projects on the behavior of Mac users. Mac users, under that perception, would tend to think that they're not in the need to protect themselves and surround themselves with safeguards as much as the equivalent PC user would. So this perception really kind of makes it easier maybe, or builds a more softer and easy to use surface for attackers. The second reason is how Apple basically introduced security feature on a later period of this OS. If we will picture it as a race, perhaps, there's no doubt that other OS are a bit ahead in this race against Apple. They are and still adding more and more security means into the OS. But each version kind of just introduces one main feature and not really a set of robust safeguards, which means that specifically older versions of Mac are just not equipped with enough or sufficient safeguards. Generally speaking, and this is not relevant only for Apple, but worldwide, there are not as much as security products for Mac as for other OSs and Windows specifically. So as an attacker, there's less threats for me on the endpoint. There's less safeguards that I need to bypass or evade from in order to perform my malicious activity. What's, I think, kind of unique in, maybe it's true for non-Windows operating systems, is that every vulnerability is critical. That means that even if I find a vulnerability which doesn't allow me to perform remote code execution or get a privilege escalation, that vulnerability can be really used to the max and allow me to perform operations that on Windows maybe would be easily detected or blocked. As I said earlier, the targets here are quite lucrative. If we're talking about having a chance to either hit a product manager, a developer, or a C-level executive, 2 out of those 3 are quite interesting and have a good return on investment, I would say. That would really promote me as an attacker. That's and the last thing, which is very unique to Mac, is how credentials are being used on the operating system. So myself, I am a PC user. I have a Windows machine, and I log on, I put in my credentials, and that's basically it. That defines the privileges that I'm working with. It defines what services and applications and resources I can get and which not. And if I want something specific, I need to get a higher privilege. Mac works a little bit differently. And in Mac, you need to put your Apple ID for many, many different operations on the machine. On one hand, it sounds safe. You need to put your credentials every time. That's a safeguard. That's a defense mechanism. But that's the way it's applied really makes the user kind of look at it in a very indifferent way. You don't even ask why this credential request popped. You just put your credentials, tap in, type OK, and this is really an attack vector that we've seen in the wild, and it promotes applications getting user credentials much more easier than in other operating systems. So this really makes OS X a very attractive target. Let's move forward. That being said, we are seeing that there are not as many OS X attacks in the wild. I mean, it is easy to say that, okay, so there are lucrative targets, it is easier to get there, it is easier to evade. Why aren't we seeing so much more attacks out there? So I think the reason is, first of all, revolves around the adoption rates. At the end of the day, there are much less users of OS X rather than for Windows. It's true that the odds are higher to get a good target or a lucrative one. But I would work much harder to make a malware or an attack vector which is applicable for a much smaller set of victims. So in order for me to, again, return my investment, I would have to work much harder than with Windows, for example. Most enterprises are not Mac shops. They do have Macs, but that percent is a very small portion of their entire stack of machine, which means if my target is an organization and not a specific person or specific role in that organization, I'm better off probably using tools made for Windows and leave Mac aside because I have more option and it'll be easier to use, and there's a much greater chance that I would get foothold or some other accomplishment in that organization going after Windows and not after Mac. On the same level, and I said it in seminar before, the monetization of the attack is harder. We can take ransomware as a good example. If you have less users, you'll have less people that will be inclined to pay for the encrypted files. Specifically in OS 6, and this is something that we might discuss a little bit more later, ransomware didn't really ever prove itself because Apple have a very good and robust file restoration mechanism called Time Machine. And if I can easily restore my files from the OS, I don't need to pay. So as I said, monetization here is just harder than with other OS. Even production servers, to be able to take this sort of server hostage, I have much more leverage over the organization rather than even encrypting the files on the CEO's machine. The next reason would be the tools. For Windows, and everyone with access to GitHub can see there are dozens, over dozens of different tools for any kind of operation or idea or attack vector that you want to propagate. And that's just not true for OS 6. OS 6 has a much smaller set of available tools. Most of them are already known and detected by native OS safeguards or other purchased security products. So it's harder to actually leverage an attack. And given all of this, and I said it many times already in this webinar, Windows is just the path of least resistance. It'll be easier for me. I have more tools to carry out whatever operation I want. And if I can choose to attack an organization via a Windows state of mind, let's say, rather than an OS 6 state of mind, I would probably prefer that. That being said, we still do see threats in the wild targeting OS 6, and we are seeing these threats being more and more prevalent. There are many reasons for that, and this is what we're going to discuss in the next slide, if we can move forward, which is, and this is what I want to discuss, the attacker state of mind. This is a little bit repeating two slides ago, but as we say, me as an attacker viewing victims in an organization, my state of mind is the following. First of all, I know that Mac users are, I don't want to say gullible, but are not as protecting and self-aware for security issues as other users. For me to get in, again, there's the same attack vectors apply. I don't need to rethink how to infiltrate the organization. I can look at how other attackers target Windows and find the way to do the same with with OS 6. Cross-platform threats are one instance of this. I know how OS 6 works. I know what the operating system put emphasis on. And I know that both on the level of the operating system and the user, if I look and behave very similar to a legitimate application, everyone will think I'm a legitimate application. Nobody will ask questions. I would not be detected very quickly, and I can operate discreetly for a long time in the machine. And for me as an attacker, the biggest challenge is to send the stolen data outside. Not that getting in is the easiest thing in the world, but detections around malicious CNC servers and path of exfiltration and means of evading from exfiltration detection is as applicable because it is done in the network level and not on the host level in many cases. So that's a challenge that I really need to consider. So this is me as an attacker, what I put on the table when deciding if and what OS 6 machine to go for. So that being said, and we said that we are seeing more and more attacks of OS 6 in the wild. So let's quickly discuss what this attacks looks like and of what sort. I think the baseline of OS 6 attacks it's just like Windows. At the end of the day, again, it's still an operating system. Users use it very similarly to other operating systems. It is true that it is built differently. It is true that it is being used maybe slightly differently by specific users, but at the end of the day, it is still an operating system. And I want to target it just like I target any other operating system. So let's move to the next slide and go over a few of the attacks that we've seen in the wild. So malicious files, obviously this is the basis of any malware. And we have seen hundreds, if not thousands of different malwares on a monthly basis. We see different malwares try different evasion techniques. We discussed looking like any other application, so being signed as a certified Apple distributor. That's something that we've seen using stolen credentials, exploiting the mechanism of signatures to look as if I'm a signed file. This is something that was recently discovered and that we address as well. So this really behaves similarly to how we see malicious files on Windows machine. The way of evading or overriding the defense mechanism is slightly different. Next is ransomware, as we discussed, hard to monetize. We have seen a few strains in the wild. Only one of them can be declared as successful. The others were a complete failure. As I said, Time Machine is just a really easy mechanism to use in order to restore files. So we don't really predict ransomware would be as a trend for OS 6 as it is for Windows. We discussed exfiltration and DGA, domain generating algorithm, which is a way to evade detection for exfiltration. This is something that is a lot of companies providing security for OS 6 put the emphasis on. Browser-based attacks, again, if we're talking about infiltration vectors, browsers are one of the most common methods, as well as phishing. Specifically, we came to a very intimate familiarity with Pirit, which is an adware, a very persistent one that was discovered and analyzed by one of the researchers here in Cybereason called Amit Serper. There's a very extent research that Amit did on this malware. We strongly recommend reading it. It is very technical, but very interesting. and really shows how attackers try to use browsers in order to infiltrate OS X machines. We discussed very quickly the cross-platform threats. .NET and Bash are very good examples, and we are seeing a lot of attacks moving towards that sort, because if I can build a single malware that would be as applicable for Windows, Linux, and Mac, I can win on a greater level than just writing a malware that is dedicated for a single OS. I'll really quickly discuss the RETs, remote access Trojans. Specifically, Proton is one of the most robust and known ones. Again, this is something that we see on every operating system. Maybe in some cases we see it in the sense of a web shell. And fileless attacks, obviously. So this, to me, goes into maybe 3 different directions. The first one is Apple scripts, which is kind of the native scripts for Mac OS. Can maybe be seen as batch files or other scripts files on Windows. There are, again, the cross-platform scripts such as Python and Bash that we do see a lot of an increased use of this type of scripts on OS X. And the third kind, and I'm going back to .NET, is as the infrastructure that allows PowerShell. So PowerShell is very known today as an attack vector for Windows. However, .NET is cross-platform, and there are PowerShell applications for Linux and Mac. And it's kind of a vector that we slowly see attackers adopt because PowerShell was so self-proving and efficient on Windows. I think that attackers are trying to see if they can gain the same profit or the same leverage on non-Windows operating systems as well. So this is really kind of a quick overview. Obviously, there are a lot of different vectors that are applicable. This is kind of the main ones that we see and deal with here at Cyberism. Some of them are very basic. Some of them are more complex. Some of them are off the shelf. Some of them are proprietary and seem to be written by a 12-year-old. We really see everything, and we keep close track on these threats. So I think if I'll do a quick overview of everything that we discussed so far. So we discussed who are the Mac targets in an organization, why would I go after them, what I have to gain from going after these targets, how would I do that, and what are the main attack vectors that I would use to leverage this attack. So the last part in this webinar is to say how we at Cyberism mitigate these threats. So the first part, and this is true not only for OS X, this is true for how we deal with threats throughout different operating systems. First step for us is visibility. We collect hundreds of different data elements from our supporting operating systems and model them in a way that we can both investigate and detect malicious activity with. So a very high-level quick overview of the information that we collect from the machines is everything about the process and its info, its image file, and the DMG that it came from, in case it does. We are also capable of saying the origin of that file, whether it came from DMG, whether it was downloaded from internet or from a store. And this information obviously used for detection and investigating files. Modules being loaded by these processes, connections, DNS requests, proxy, including the pack files, the origin I already said, drivers, and pretty much everything that you can think about that exists in a Windows machine. We collect as well from OS X, LaunchD, daemons, etc. Everything that is the equivalent of autoruns in OS X, login sessions, and much more. Quickly depicting our threat model. We collect all of this information. We model it in a very unique way in our in-memory graph, which is used both for retention and for detection. And once this information is modeled, we apply different algorithms basically to create evidences. Evidences is saying something interesting happened. We're not saying yet it is malicious or suspicious. It just happened, and we want to acknowledge it. The second level is our suspicions, which usually point to an evidence saying this is not only needs to be acknowledged, it needs to be acknowledged as suspicious. And users should be aware of the illegitimacy of that evidence. The third level is what we call a malloc, a malicious operation, which points to these suspicions and evidences and saying, hey, there's a malicious operation going on, and you as a user need to be aware of that. This is really kind of a very quick overview of our threat model, and obviously our visibility and collection is the basis for this model. I just want to add a little bit more about our detections, which is in the next slide. Again, I think that it is quite evident that these detections are relevant for the majority of the operating systems that we support. I would first say that obviously we use different reputation mechanism to decide whether a file is malicious, suspicious, or not. We have a feature, a mechanism that we built here in Cybereason to help us classify different files and decide whether they are malicious or not. The second part is obviously using threat intel and IOCs to decide whether the behavior of a specific file or application is associated with malicious activity. We allow users to blacklist specific IOCs, whether it's hashes, IPs, domain, etc., to decide whether it is something that they don't want in their network and they want to be alerted once it is in their network. Web shells, which is more maybe applicable to Mac servers and Linux servers. DGA, the domain generating algorithm, as I mentioned earlier, as the evasion technique for exfiltration, and dozens of different behavioral detection based on execution path, based on process hierarchy, based on autoruns, based on locations, based on extensions, based on every single behavior that the process shows. So this was really kind of the quick overview of OS X and its targets, attack surface, and mitigation. Thank you for listening in, guys.
And now I think we have time for questions. So guys, keep on sending us your questions. We have a few of them. So thank you for asking us. I hope we can cover all of them. Nimrod, the first one that comes in is, what is, in your point of view, the biggest difference between Mac and Windows attacks?
So I would say there's not a lot of difference. At the end of the day, yes, these are two different operating systems. But as I said earlier, a lot of these attacks are very similar. They're just being implemented a little bit differently when targeting different machines. I think maybe the only difference that we can discuss is the impact of each and every attack. As I said earlier, when going to Windows, different vulnerabilities will allow you more specific or more generic power over the system. And in a lot of cases, kind of more low-level exploits or vulnerabilities will not allow you to perform a lot of interesting or worthy actions. And I think that on Mac, kind of the same level of vulnerability will allow you to perform a more valuable or worthy gain in the endpoint.
Wonderful. Next question. What is your prediction in terms of the future of these type of attacks? Are we going to see more of them?
So I think the easy answer is yes. And if going back 5 years from now, we have seen very little OS6 attacks, and today we see so much more. I think that attackers of OS6 are just a little bit behind when it comes to attack vectors. And I think we would definitely see much more fileless attacks targeted towards Mac users. Once they understand how they can leverage it as easily and simply and in a scalable manner as they do on Windows, I'm sure that is definitely the next step of kind of main threats for OS6 users.
Question coming from the audience. What does the abbreviation of DGA stand for? And maybe explain a little bit more about that.
Sure. So DGA stands for Domain Generating Algorithm. It's usually quite a small code that a malware possesses that is generating a lot of DNS queries that it generates randomly, automatically. And this DNS request allows you two things. First of all, it allows the attacker to create a lot of noise around the application trying to connect its CNC, its remote command and control server. So the noise allows, it disrupts analysts and security personnel from finding what is the actual CNC server that the malware is communicating with. The other and maybe more prominent use of DGA is redundancy. If one of my CNC servers was compromised and I cannot use it anymore, I know the kind of range of DNS queries used or generated by the malware, and I can easily write a new domain that the malware would contact and have a new CNC up and running very quickly. So this, you can maybe call it sustainability of the malware, and it is a very both useful and prevalent attack vector, or in this case, evasion vector.
Interesting question coming about adware. We know that this is becoming more prevalent in macOS. What would be your recommendation for dealing with adware? Should we just dismiss it?
So as we said earlier, using the browser in adware is targeting browsers is something that we see as an increasing attack vector in the wild. I think mainly because it really proves itself as a good infiltration vector. My recommendation is whenever coming in contact with adware, don't be indifferent. Don't just say it's not interesting, it's just an adware, it's not going to impact. I think that Pirate, again, the adware that was investigated and analyzed by Amit Serper, is a very good example of how, in a way, what's the word I'm looking for? Something that doesn't seem very threatening or cardinal can inflict a lot of damage, or can be used to allow other malware to inflict a lot of damage. Specifically, Pirate is extremely persistent, and removing it is not an easy task to do. There are specific guidelines as to how to remove it, and I think those guidelines can be used as some sort of general guidelines for removing adware. But my general recommendation, and this is not even solely for OS X users, I would say the same for Windows users. If you have the capability of removing a threat, remove it. Don't be indifferent.
Another question is, how do we discover and ultimately manage Macs in the enterprise? What tools can be used to discover them? I guess a lot of organizations have BYOD and people bring their own device. What would you recommend doing to discover those devices?
So as you said, a lot of organizations today have BYOD or MDMs that use to manage devices in the organizations. Being an ex-security and privacy consultant, I would recommend that organizations, first of all, have a very clear policy on how and if Macs are allowed in the environment. Be strong. If there are any IT managers listening to us, be as strong as you can against your C-level executives. I know they really want those Macs, but if you decide that Mac is supported in your environment, have a very clear, organized, and managed policy around who gets a Mac and what is the minimal requirements as for security that you demand that Mac to have. I think that cyber reason visibility can also be used to get a better notion of what Macs are in your environment. We don't have a very specific device discovery feature for Mac at this time, but as a whole, as a company, we are kind of leaning a little bit more towards network security, and that area would can definitely be covered in the future as well.
And with that, I think we will conclude. That was the last question. So thank you everyone for attending this webinar. If you have additional questions, please feel free to reach out to myself or to Nimrod. You can see our emails on that slide. We will be happy to answer any of your questions, or if you would like to learn more about the Cyber Reason platform and how it addresses Mac OS X threats, please go to our website or just reach out to us. We will be delighted to have you again in one of our webinars. We hope you enjoyed it and have a great day. Thank you, Nimrod, for being with us today.
Thank you for having me. Thank you guys for listening.
Thank you. Have a great day.